All right, let's take a look at the English exception. And what I'm talking about is the English exception to absolutism that reigned everywhere else in Europe at the time. So we're going to start off by looking at Charles I and his fights with Parliament. In 1625, Charles I was enthroned as the King of England. And he always needed money, primarily because he was at war with both Spain and France most of the time. So he had to raise money to be able to fight those wars. Now, to do so, he had to ask Parliament for that money. So several times he went to Parliament. Parliament refused to give him funds. As a result, he got angry and he basically dissolved Parliament because they wouldn't give him the money he needed. So in 1628, he was forced to call Parliament once again, because he needed money. All right, so they basically refused to grant the king any money until he signed what was known as the Petition of Rights. So Parliament's going to impose what's called the Petition of Rights on him. Here's a picture of what the Petition of Rights actually looked like. So the king agreed to 4 points that were actually in the Petition of Rights. Here are the 4 points in the Petition of Rights that he agreed to. First, he would not imprison subjects without due cause. Also, he would not levy taxes without Parliament's consent. He would then not house soldiers in private homes. And then he would not impose martial law in peacetime. So these were all things that were seen as violation of the rights of subjects in England. And so Parliament believed that the king could not abuse these rights if he agreed to basically adhere to them. So, and these would be things that we would be familiar with because some of these were some of the same complaints that people made during the Revolutionary War. Okay, so after agreeing to the petition, Charles essentially ignored the petition. He did not adhere to the rights as he was supposed to. So in 1629, Charles once again dissolved Parliament and he refused to call it back into session. So by 1637, Charles once again needed more money and he called on Parliament into session again. Now in the autumn of 1641, Parliament once again opposed the king and passed laws to limit royal power. So you can see there's a trend here that between the authority of the king and Parliament. And so elsewhere in Europe where absolutists became very powerful kings, in England Parliament was trying to trump the power of the actual king. So in January 1642, Charles tried to arrest Parliament's leaders. Obviously, they were not going along with what he wanted to do. They were not granting him money and free power, and so they were working against him. But in this case, Parliament escaped before they could be arrested. Now, Charles himself had to flee London, and so he went to the north where he raised an army. And you can see on this map, this diagram basically shows you the outcome of what's going on. It's essentially a civil war. So between 1642 and 1645, there's going to be a civil war between the supporters of the king and the supporters of Parliament. Okay, and you can see the areas here on this map that are in purple are the areas that were controlled by the Puritans, which were primarily the members of Parliament who were opposed to the king, and the sort of yellow-orangish areas are the areas that are controlled by the Royalists, or the supporters of the king. And you can see where the major battles took place. And based on this map, you can see in 1642 it's a simple sort of split between the north and the south. And again, it looks like the king is gaining some upper hand in 1643, but by 1644 and 1645, the king's forces are pretty much being defeated. Okay, so and here's some images of what the battles might have looked like. Again, these artist renditions of the conflict. Right, so again, it raged from 1642 to 1649. Now, the two main groups fighting in the war were what were called Cavaliers, and these were people who remained loyal to Charles and were called Royalists, or again, were called Cavaliers. And then there were also the other side, were the Roundheads, which were basically the Puritan supporters of Parliament. They basically wore their hair very short over their ears, and that's where the term Roundhead came from. So these were the two main forces that were fighting with each other during the English Civil War, Cavaliers versus Roundheads. Okay, now, the person that you need to know is Oliver Cromwell. And Cromwell's going to set up a commonwealth because in 1646, Cromwell basically defeated the Cavaliers. He defeated the king. And he actually held the king prisoner. He captured the king and held him prisoner. And then in 1649, they finally decided to execute Charles. Essentially, he had his head chopped off. And this is a big deal because never in English history, or for European history for that matter, had a king been captured in a civil war and been executed like this. So the fact that the Puritans were able to do this was a major event in English history. Now, he also abolished the monarchy and the House of Lords. In addition, they established a commonwealth, which is a republican form of government. So again, you went from a monarchy to what we would call a republican form of government. Okay, in this case, a commonwealth. Now, in 1653, Cromwell decided to dissolve Parliament completely. So no House of Lords, no House of Commons. There just would be no Parliament. He actually drafted a constitution, but in the end he ignored the constitution. He tore up the document, and he decided instead to rule as a military dictator, and imposing a Puritan way of life on everybody in England. Then in 1658, Cromwell died. And with his death, England, which had at this point become sort of tired of having a Puritan way of life imposed on them, chose to elect a new parliament. So new members of parliament were selected at this time. And you can see on the right-hand side here is an image of Cromwell's death mask and what he looked like at the time of his death. All right, by 1659, Parliament then voted to ask the older son of Charles I to rule England. So they basically were asking the monarchy to come back to power. In this case, they were asking Charles I's son to come in, and that's Charles II. So at this point, Charles II would come back as king, and once he did things like restore theater, sporting events, dancing. These were all sort of social things that had been banned by the Puritans, and so he was able to bring those things back, and that of course made the populace sort of happy to have the king back. He also in 1679 had to agree to what Parliament had passed, and that was a bill called habeas corpus. And this law gave every prisoner the right to be brought before a judge. So again, this is something that we're familiar with. The right of habeas corpus means that you have the right to a trial. So this was a law that was passed in England in 1679 by Parliament under Charles II. In 1685, James II came to the throne. Now, this was a change because he offended the subjects because he was actually a Catholic. He was not a Protestant. And as a result of his Catholicism, many people were upset with that. Not just Puritans, but most Protestants in England at that time, especially after the English Reformation. So Parliament basically protested the fact that James was flaunting his Catholicism. So James, as a result, got upset and decided that he would just dissolve Parliament, much like Charles I had done. So again, English Protestants became upset. They became terrified at the prospect of a line of Catholic kings. They still didn't trust Roman Catholicism at this point, especially after the Reformation. All right, so you get what's called the Glorious Revolution. In this case, James's daughter, Mary, was actually a Protestant, and she was the wife of William of Orange, who was a prince in the Netherlands. Here's a picture of both Mary and William of Orange. And so Parliament essentially invited William and Mary to overthrow James for the sake of Protestantism. So they invited them to come back to England and rule, and that way they could eliminate James and not be afraid of becoming a Catholic nation. William led his army to London in 1688, and James, as a result, basically fled to France to escape. And William and Mary were recognized by Parliament and as partners in governing England, and as a result, England became what we call a constitutional monarchy. And so, in this case, what we know about constitutional monarchies is that laws essentially limit the ruler's power. So in this case, the English exception is that instead of having an absolute monarchy like you see in France or Russia at about the same time, instead England became a constitutional monarchy where Parliament ruled over the king by establishing a set of laws. Okay, so how did they do this? Well, in 1689, William and Mary officially consented to what was called the Bill of Rights. There's a picture of the Bill of Rights on the right here. Okay, what's in the Bill of Rights that they agreed to? Well, first, no suspending of Parliament's laws. You can't dissolve Parliament. Also, no levying of taxes without a specific grant from Parliament. Okay, so no taxation without representation. And then no interfering with freedom of speech in Parliament. So this concept of freedom of speech comes out of the Bill of Rights as well. And then no penalty for a citizen who petitions the king about grievances. So you can't, be punished because you raise complaints about the way the king is running the country or the way that the government is functioning. So no penalty for anybody that does that. So these are all essentially things that are in the Bill of Rights, and it's something that we should be familiar with because Remember, our heritage, our political heritage in this country, comes from the English system because the United States really came out of the 13 colonies. The colonies were all ruled by England, and of course, the Bill of Rights was the document that ruled Parliament over the king, and as a result, the colonies often thought that these rights applied to them as well. Of course, the revolution in America was really about the fact that we felt that these rights weren't being applied to us because of our colonial status. But essentially, this process of England being an exception to absolutism, where parliament and government ruled over the king, very different than what else is going on in Europe, but it's also part of the legacy that leads to the creation of the United States and our system of government as well.